Okay, we fixed it. Thank
Welcome to AI for Good, the leading, action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by the International Telecommunication Union, the United Nations Agency for Digital Technologies, in partnership with 40+ UN sister organizations and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify innovative applications, build skills and standards, and advance partnerships to solve global challenges. In today's AI for Good event, we are counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished facilitators and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our third installment in the AI for Good series on navigating truth in crisis, the dual role of AI in harmful information and humanitarian action. I'm Justin Brady. I'm the chief of the Interagency Standing Committee Secretariat, and I have the honor to be hosting today's event in collaboration with the International Telecommunications Union. This session is part of our AI in Humanitarian Action series, spring series, which is a collaboration between the IASC, UN OCHA, and AI for Good. Through this initiative, we aim to bridge knowledge gaps and foster collaborative learning to ensure AI serves humanitarian needs effectively and responsibly. Through our previous two sessions, we have started building a community of practice stakeholders, humanitarians working with AI to consolidate fragmented knowledge and siloed experiences. This, again, our third in the series, we will discuss harmful information, misinformation, disinformation, which can significantly worsen humanitarian crises. AI can be both a challenge and a tool in the landscape, fueling the spread of false narratives while also offering innovative solutions to detect and combat them. We will explore pressing questions such as the most significant challenges in combating misinformation, the dual role of AI in spreading and mitigating false narratives, and the ethical dilemmas we face when deploying AI in the humanitarian context. To ensure clarity between the different terminologies we'll be using, let's first spell out what we mean. Misinformation is the false or inaccurate information spread without malicious intent. Harmful information is information that can cause harm or exacerbate crisis. And disinformation is deliberately misleading or biased information spread with the intent to deceive. Today, we have a distinguished panel of experts who will shed light on the challenges, ethical considerations, and innovative solutions in this dynamic field, all embedded in the humanitarian context. Our panelists will also discuss how we can help communities determine the trustworthiness of AI-generated content and the importance of collaboration among humanitarian organizations, tech partners, and policymakers. I'm pleased to welcome a panel of distinguished speakers today. We're very fortunate to have with us Mr. Philippe Stoll, Senior Tech Diplomacy Delegate, International Committee of the Red Cross, Ms. Giselle Lomax, Senior Advisor on Information Integrity on Digital Platforms from UNHCR. Ms. Helen McElhaney, Executive Director of the CDAC Network, and Ms. Stella Suge, Executive Director of FilmAid Kenya. Following the panel, there should be time for discussions, and if at any time you have questions, you can share them in the chat. Now let's dive into our first question on the challenges and context of combating misinformation in humanitarian settings. And I'd like to call on Helen McElhaney to speak first. Ms. McElhaney leads the CDAC Network, the global alliance of organizations working to ensure people can access safe, trustworthy information and communicate during crisis. Previously a humanitarian aid worker and civil servant, Helen held senior roles with DFID and FCDO and worked in posts in Sana'a and Riyadh and across His Majesty's government for more than a decade. In recent years, Helen joined the ICRC as head of policy for UK and Ireland. Helen has a master's degree in international relations from the University of Cambridge, an LLM in human rights law from the University of Glasgow, and an LLB from the University of Strathclyde. Helen, given the rapid spread of harmful information during crisis, your experience in humanitarian aid policy, what do you see as the most pressing challenges in combating misinformation and disinformation in humanitarian settings? And are there specific contexts that are particularly at risk? Over to you, Helen.
Thank you very much, Justin, and thank you everybody for joining us today. It's a real privilege to have this space. Sadly, we've got some big challenges to talk about today, and I'm sure we're going to get into that very quickly. And I've got the unlucky job of laying out some of those big trends that we're all facing at the moment. But let's kick off. We are now well over a decade into the so-called social media age, very much on the cusp of, if not in the middle of the AI age. And the challenge of harmful information in crisis settings has evolved rapidly and dangerously, especially with the advent of AI and recent major political shifts. One of the most pressing challenges is what I would call the collapse of trust in the information environment. In crisis zones, people need reliable, actionable information: where to go for medical care, which routes are safe, how do you reach family. And that basic information is life-saving, and the CDAC network and its members have long advocated for information to be a form of aid in and of itself. But that information and those communication channels are increasingly crowded out by misinformation and deliberate disinformation. And this disinformation in particular, which is so pernicious, is no longer just background noise. This is running alongside every humanitarian crisis that we're dealing with globally. And it is also systematically manufactured at scale, with AI accelerating the volume and the believability of synthetic content. We're seeing hyper-realistic fake images, videos, and AI-generated posts using to confuse and manipulate and inflame. And sadly, conflict zones are well-known testing grounds for this AI-enabled disinformation. In Myanmar, we've seen this over a number of years, and sadly, again, this is resurfaced with the recent earthquake response and the weaponized rumors that we've seen in the aftermath. In geopolitical hotspots like Gaza and Ukraine, and then now we're seeing emerging in Kashmir. We've seen flooding of the ecosystem to generate confusion very, very effectively. And in Ethiopia's Tigray region, disinformation was shown to have played a very direct role in civilian harms. And those are just a few of the examples. And it's not only about the people who are connected and online, right? The most important thing, and the thing that we have to get our head around, is that these narratives that are being driven by these new capabilities, these shape donor behavior, they shape media framing, and they shape political will. Whether people in crisis are connected or not, their reality and what resources they get access to is now shaped by how the story is told about them. And sadly, we're living in a time when support to really important local independent media outlets, many of whom CDAC members have been supporting for years, has all been slashed. It's been one of the the main targets of recent donor budget cuts. So we have seen that there is a layer in which the humanitarian sector is being directly targeted within wider anti-Western rhetoric narratives. Sometimes we're a cipher for the West, sometimes not, but there have been very specific campaigns to smear humanitarian organisations, some of whom I'm sharing a panel with. And this undermines the trust, very fragile trust that communities place in us and weakens our ability to operate safely. It also really undermines the very concept of humanitarianism, humanitarian values, and the license to operate at all. On other occasions, the humanitarian sector and the communities at the heart of humanitarian response are merely collateral damage in a wider strategic narrative contest that's playing out. I'd also like to flag this very deeply worrying new trend that has emerged in recent months, which is the erosion of the digital and institutional infrastructure in some donor governments. We've seen critical humanitarian offices being gutted, budgets slashed from billions to a fraction of their former size, and hundreds of expert positions eliminated. And that is not just a staffing issue. It's a collapse of institutional memory, of evaluative capacity and data systems. We're entering a time of what I've heard being referred to as data deserts in some of the humanitarian crisis settings that we are really very worried about. And that ability to create knowledge and then generate information and evidence on the back of that, the trend line is downwards in our capability to be able to do that. So we've got the absence of the digital infrastructure that had been set up. We're also seeing deliberate information vacuums. Now, that's always been the case in crisis and emergency. At the outset, you don't have connectivity, things are down. We've always seen propaganda and rumours and various other things, but this is a new trend. And without those early warning systems, and where specific translation and language services are being removed, and certain commitments erased from public agencies, into that silence, harmful narratives are then allowed to spread unchecked, and our ability to counter some of that becomes all the more difficult. So this really isn't a theoretical. We can all feel it, fear of retaliation, just for speaking about these sorts of issues. And that tells us something about the culture of fear and disinformation that's becoming normalized even in stable contexts and donor contexts, which then has a flow and a consequence into more fragile settings. So we've got this wider trend of the trust collapsing, content moderation being scaled back, especially in underrepresented languages. It's never very good in those anyway. Social media platforms having laid off their trust and safety teams and restricted access to data. And we do have this potential for AI and other capabilities to step in, but they're not yet really nuanced enough to handle some of this complexity, and certainly not the political complexity, especially outside of English. And just to add to the mix, we also know that disinformation is increasingly monetized, right? This is an industry, people are making money, as well as seeking strategic effect in very sensitive conflict environments. And in some cases, it's the very young people in refugee camps that we're trying to support who are being paid to create and spread false content while others profit upstream. Data and narratives like this have become commodities that fuel conflict, very, very sadly. I do want to wrap up at the outset by really focusing on the gap that's emerging in support to local media. Just in Myanmar, where we've been talking to many local media outlets recently, there was 70 media outlets, independent public media outlets, that were relied on US funding. And when that was withdrawn, 200 journalists in exile immediately affected, with all the consequences that then means for their ability to carry out their work. And they would have been central to being able to provide information to communities in crisis and be able to discern what was actually going on in the sorts of context that we work in. And we're seeing that sort of very grounded, real consequence in a number of emergencies. So this panel discussion would have been hard enough a few months ago. It's now a profoundly challenging new operating environment, and the humanitarian sector haven't quite figured out what capabilities we need, how we collaborate on this, and what we can do to help communities navigate these operational environments that they find themselves in.
Helen, thank you so much for that excellent overview of the pressing challenges that we're facing with AI-generated misinformation and disinformation in the humanitarian setting. I'm pleased now to turn to Philippe Stoll. Mr. Stoll works currently at the intersection between technologies and armed conflict with the International Committee of the Red Cross. He engages with governments, the academic, humanitarian, and private sectors with the objective to better protect people affected by armed conflicts from the impact of AI, cyber warfare, digital surveillance, harmful information, or autonomous weapons systems. Passionate with making these issues more concrete, he created the Digital Dilemmas immersive experience and co-produced an online course, Humanitarian Action in the Digital Space. In October 2024, with EPFL and the Swiss mission to the UN in New York, he co-created the installation Deepfake and You, presented at UN headquarters. In his 22 years of career with ICRC, Philippe has managed strategic and public communications at headquarters and was based in Sierra Leone, Israel, and the occupied territories, India, and conducted field missions to Afghanistan, Myanmar, Lebanon, Ethiopia, and Ukraine. Philippe, while AI can amplify misinformation leading to the spread of false narratives, it also holds the potential to mitigate these issues by identifying and countering false information. The deployment of AI in this domain raises several ethical dilemmas and practical questions that need careful consideration. What are the key ethical dilemmas when deploying AI to detect or respond to misinformation in a humanitarian setting?
Thank you, Justin, for the question, and thank you for having me. It's very exciting and very interesting. It's a very good question, spot on, because everyone sees the potential of using these tools to help understand what's going on, to detect false videos, for example, deepfakes. If I look at these specific technologies, we know that AI has a strong potential. That's what we read, that's what we can see from scientific reports, etc. But as a humanitarian organization, we have to be very cautious and to understand what's going on. There are many elements we need to be sure that it won't create additional problems or won't create problems for the organization or for affected populations before we jump into these new shiny tools. I don't know how the audience is getting the same messages that I keep getting on a regular basis. Is your organization ready for integrating AI tools, etc.? So there is a lot of hype, there is a lot of pressure, but on our side, we decided to take a little bit of a distance and think thoroughly before going directly in using these shiny tools. So this is something that we have been exploring for quite some years, and we continue to explore. And here, a big spoiler alert, we work a lot with the academic world, especially here in Switzerland with the two Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne and Zurich. We worked around these issues already back in 2018. It was not so much AI tools, but they were a component of machine learning. And what was interesting is that there was a lot of somehow false positive, as we call it, because we were basing the reading of certain social media messages on the sentiment. And because we work in conflict situation, a lot of these messages, even if they were positive about the ICRC, they came out as negative because there was the word war. And the sentiment around that question shows that it creates kind of a fog in between the reality of an information and what was the intent of the person. So we continue to work, we continue to try to improve, but this is to give you an idea that you have a great tool, but somehow not as efficient as we would expected it to be. We are still exploring, as I said, but while we saw the growing use of AI in the tools that we could explore, there were a few things we wanted to better understand, especially around how AI has an impact on humanitarian organization and the humanitarian sector. And that's why we came up end of last year with a policy in order to help us to create the exact frame. So it helps us to define exactly until where we can go and with whom. So this policy that is public, by the way, you can find it on our website, is something that we try to look from two different perspectives. The first one is who we are as an organization. What are the constitutive elements that makes us special? We are not a private company, not for profit, etc. But also there are some elements that are specific to the organization because we work in armed conflict. And the other element is the technology itself. So we did throughout reflections, merging both and using what was already existing. So we didn't want to be only Eurocentric or Western centric. So we went and looked at, for example, the African Union directive. We went to the ASEAN, all these different organizations that have published great documents that help us to make our thinking forward. And as a quick note on how we looked at things, first, we looked at how our humanitarian principles impact technologies, how we as an organization, we should be accountable to affected people. And this element is very strong for us that we don't want to test on people. We don't want to create new harm or potential harm to a population if suddenly we start to explore how is certain wording against a community, and therefore will enhance the speeches or the hate speech against this population because of the testing we do, and this becomes higher in the algorithm, for example. And this leads to the questions also of the technology itself. We know that a lot of these technology live in black boxes. It's very difficult to access how the technology was built, what were the data sets, how the model has been trained, etc. So these are the questions related to biases, to the question of safety, transparency. One key element is the explainability also. We want to be understanding ourselves, so potentially we can explain it to people. And last but not least, the one of the paramount elements is the question of data protection. If we use certain data that relates to populations or to our informations that we have secured thanks to a confidential dialogue, these are the things we want to be sure that if we deploy or use a tool, this is not going to be detrimental to this to our policy related to data protection. So as I mentioned, we wanted to see tools. We might test them, but really outside an operational context, but also in a way to try to find solutions with academic institution. And this is the state where we are. We haven't found the magic tool, unfortunately, it doesn't exist. But we want to be sure that if we find something, this is something that will be according to the basic principles we have, and be sure that the questions that we will use for understanding the issues of harmful information will be very well treated. So this is a little bit in a nutshell where we are. I don't have, unfortunately, tools or list of tools that you can use as a humanitarian organization or as a non-for-profit organization. But watch this space. Maybe sooner or later we'll come with something based on the collaboration we have with different academic institutions.
Great, thank you very much, Philippe. You touched on privacy and bias. Can you just speak very quickly about perhaps over reliance on automated systems as a concern?
One element that was alluded by Helen, and I'm sure my fellow panelists will also explain, is the question of the context in which we work. I think some models might work very well in English, but we know also that the spread of harmful information is also offline. And over relying on automatic tools might blind us from the reality or from different realities that exist in the context where we work. And for us, this is something we don't want to fall into this kind of trap of saying, we have a beautiful analysis on the computer, whereas next door, the reality is totally different. So the biases relates to indeed the way the model were created, very often in the West, and don't factor in the cultural dimension, the sensitivity, or the simply the habits in which the habits of the populations where we work. So the irony, jokes, etc., is often not very well understood by an automated tool. But also, and this is no secret, I think everyone is aware of that other languages than the basic big ones, these tools don't work. Ellen mentioned Myanmar. I forgot how many languages exist. I don't think most of them have been integrated. So for you to try to be understanding what's going on, if you rely only on English, I'm sure you miss the point of understanding what's going on. And one thing which is quite important, when we speak about harmful information at the ICRC, we look at it from the two perspectives. From the perspective of the organization, how much it harms the organization, the trust, the potential access, the security of our staff. This is one point. But for us, what is also very important is how much this harmful information impact the safety, the security, the vulnerabilities of affected population. And this is one angle that is quite often forgotten, because definitely we try to look at what impacts us first and maybe later the affected population. So.
Excellent, Philippe. Thank you for that insight, and I think Ellen also, touching on this aspect about conflict settings and how those really are proving to be more vulnerable. Having served in Sudan over the past year or more, just about 6 months ago, coming out of there, it certainly was an issue. I'd like to now turn to Ms. Stella Suge. Ms. Suge is a visionary nonprofit leader with a strong commitment to equality, empowerment, and humanitarian reform. As executive director of FilmAid Kenya, Stella has led the organization's transition from an internationally driven initiative to a nationally focused nonprofit that champions locally led solutions. Through the power of storytelling, media, and arts, FilmAid addresses critical issues such as mental health, education, gender equality, climate change, and economic empowerment. FilmAid uses film and other media to bring life-saving information, psychological relief, and hope to refugees and other communities in need. FilmAid envisions a world in which all people can lead safe and healthy lives, enjoying full access to information, education, and the opportunity for creative expression. A core aspect of Stella's work involves training refugees as media professionals, amplifying their voices and enabling them to reshape narratives and advocate for their communities. Initiatives like FilmAid's annual film festival and partnership with the Kenya Film Commission have bridged gaps between refugees and host communities while contributing to national policy dialogue. Stella is a strong advocate for localization within the AIDS sector, contributing to global platforms such as DevX World, CDAC Network, ICRC, and UNHCR. As former chair of the NGO Refugee Group in Kenya, Stella collaborated with over 30 country directors to drive impactful refugee programs. Stella holds a BA in Economics and Business Studies from Kenyatta University, leadership training from Geli and EUI, and a CPA Part 1. She believes in the transformative power of opportunity and inclusion to drive sustainable change. Stella, as FilmAid works closely with communities you serve, How has the emergence of AI impacted your organization and humanitarian sector at large? And what roles do you see AI playing in aiding humanitarian efforts and in being potentially misused by those with harmful intentions? Over to you.
Many thanks, Justin, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues. It's an honor for me to be here to share some of the experiences that we have. FilmAid Kenya works in the refugee operation here in Kenya, the two large refugee operations in Dadaab and Kakuma refugee camps, largely serving Somali population and South Sudanese amongst many other communities from Eastern Horn of Africa. So certainly, Justin, AI is something that is impacting the operation, the humanitarian work here in Kenya and the rest of the world. And perhaps to start off from a broader perspective is that, of course, this is something that we are seeing as a way that we're making decisions about the delivery of services. And just to use an example, in Kenya, we have approximately 1 million refugees now, slightly over 850,000. That's a significant number of people. And obviously, broadly, people in displacement is already more than 120 million people. And that's a significant population. So if we talk about, let's say, the power of artificial intelligence is that for this such a big population, we are able to actually use AI to put huge amounts of data and process that data to make decisions more easily, more quickly, more effectively, cost effectively as well for this population. So I think obviously on the positive side, there's really something that AI can bring to the work that we're doing in humanitarian setting, and particularly for refugees. For FilmAid, to narrow down, as an organization that is focusing on delivering information to this population, I think AI has a lot of potential for us. If you talk about, for example, the power of translation, we already have more than 20 languages that are spoken in the communities that we work. And AI can be quite powerful in effectively translating information. For example, when we have any kind of emergency, any kind of crisis that ranges from, from influx, from floods or insecurity, for which sometimes you need to be able to deliver that information pretty much within hours, if not less than hours. So I think there's, really great things that we could see with them, with AI just broadly, but also, for example, in the specific context that we work, as well as specifically for the work of FilmAid. But obviously, one of the, some of the things that I am quite cautious about personally is, of course, the application of AI. We may miss out on the values that we have collectively developed over the, over 50 years in the sector, whether we're talking about, accountability to affected population, the sphere standards, for which, all of that we talk about, the center of our response being the person, and for FilmAid, community engagement and ensuring that the affected population is part and parcel of the decisions that are being taken. So obviously, the way it's unfolding yet is that we are not yet engaging this very disadvantaged, affected community of people in displacement or people in migration, such as refugees. And I think that obviously is steering us away from the work that we build, the values that we build over the last 50, 60 years of working within humanitarian action. And coming to the experience of FilmAid is that, of course, now with a lot of access, even if it's the refugee camps, there's reasonable access to internet, to smartphones. And we are seeing a very rapidly evolving uptake of these services. And what that means also is that there is really now an increased danger for all sorts of, harmful information, misinformation, and disinformation. And sometimes this can really then increase the harm to the communities. Just a few, we've had these experiences in Kenya during COVID-19, where FilmAid, had to struggle a lot to give the correct information or to counter all these types of information that was going to the community, whether it was just around rumors, for example, about the government of Kenya trying to get the refugees forcefully out of Kenya, or that the vaccines, for example, were going to be harmful to refugees, that there were different types of vaccines that were just specific to refugees, to most recently, when we are talking about assistance reducing and the food basket that was going to refugees reduced. And there was also spiraling information online. And this also ended up with insecurity, the communities protesting and destroying the little property that is there to enable us to provide enough services. So I think, of course, there's a lot of challenges around managing information, of course, in a timely manner, because of now the access to internet AI tools and members of the community, therefore generating negative, harmful information and misinformation. And one of the things as well is that sometimes that misinformation can come from outside of the context of the refugee camp here in Kenya, because of course, digital media and media as a whole is connecting every part of the world. So from Kakuma refugee camp, there are people that have resettled to Western countries, and that of course can also, can be a source of the information that is outside of the of the camp. So I think generally it's going to be a mixed pot. And one of the challenges, again, as it relates to the values that we've gone through, we've talked about and build a case around the importance of the provision of services from the ground as part of the localization. And obviously, because of the way funding can be available to displaced communities, therefore the affected communities, refugee-led organizations, community-based organizations is actually still very limited. And that also kind of steers us away from the values that we built and where we thought we were going, where the communities would lead services to themselves. So because in general, on the ground, it's difficult to access, if you talk about networks, for example, with tech companies, or to access funding from donors, that is something that is pretty much still hierarchical and generally remains inaccessible. So I think, some of these conversations, therefore, present a great opportunity to be able to build partnerships and networks that enable all these different types of organizations to start to work with the right people to build the tech, to be able to process the data, to be able to be part of decision making. And when it comes to, for example, the kinds of decisions that we make about communities, FilmAid at the end of last year had an engagement with members of the community of the affected population in Kakuma refugee camp, and there was all sorts of feedback, because of course the community has the wisdom as it relates to how we can provide services to them, including even if we are transitioning into tech and things that may be new to them. It doesn't take away, first of all, their capacity to decide how services should be provided to them. And I mean, there was just that whole concern that there's big discussions at the global level by many different people, excluding that community. And communities are talking about how can we be included to be part of the discussions on how this transition is happening. Because obviously, if you are taking decisions about me, I must still be part of the process. And so, and if you talk about refugee camps in Kenya, is something very unique. It's not represented by the data that exists currently. That means it doesn't represent its culture, it doesn't represent its languages, its identity, and therefore it then becomes something that is still very exclusive to communities. And yet we're talking about using this, this information that we process to take decisions about those communities and how we provide the services to them. And I think also just just to wrap up as well, is to say that for the communities, if you're talking about all these changes, is really what then is the level of commitment to provide prerequisite education for them to be part of the discourse in discussing all the changes, whether it's policy, it's tech, it's the way it's being applied to them. Justin.
Excellent. Thank you, Stella. The very practical examples you're giving there from Filming Kenya's work with refugees in Kenya. And I think, again, a theme that's coming through is those that are spreading, disinformation are tailoring it to the audience they're looking at, language, culture, and that needs to be part of the mitigation as well. I'd like to now turn to Gisela Lomax. Ms. Lomax is the Senior Advisor on Information Integrity at UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, leading a digital protection capacity to address the harmful impact of information risks such as misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech on refugees and people forced to flee on humanitarian action. Following a career in journalism with global media organizations, Gisela joined the UN in 2011, a year of global disruption to the information ecosystem driven by digital platforms. She has worked in partnerships, external engagement, digital and strategic communications roles across various parts of the UN, including on climate action, human rights, peace building, disarmament, trade, and development. Gisela, I think an appropriate segue coming from Stella to you. Given the critical role of accurate and trustworthy information in humanitarian contexts, especially for vulnerable populations, we'd like to explore the ethical considerations and practical implications of AI in this domain. And my question is, based on your extensive experience, how can humanitarians help communities determine the trustworthiness of AI-generated content, verify the information they are receiving, which will inform their decisions on accessing aid and protection services, particularly in volatile contexts? Over to you, Gisela.
Thanks very much, Justin, and hi everybody. Good afternoon and good morning. It's great to take part in this very timely and relevant session alongside many of our UNHCR partners. I think just to start with, on this trust issue, to zoom out a little bit onto the problem. As you said in your intro, threats to information integrity on digital platforms, such as misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech, are worsening, and we see direct correlation and sometimes causation with real-world protection harms, especially in the most vulnerable, volatile contexts, wars, conflicts, and emergencies. These harms can be physical, violence and killings, as well as economic, social, psychological. These information risks, as we broadly call them, can even be a factor in forced displacement. We see direct targeting of refugees with adversarial, false and hateful narratives, the framing of refugees as security, economic and cultural threats being normalised. And at the same time, and I think Helen pointed to this as well, we see tech companies and digital platforms removing guardrails and reducing trust and safety capacities. We focus very much on the harms to communities and the protection harms, but I'd be remiss if I didn't speak about the risks and harms to humanitarian actors as well. And Philippe also pointed to this. We're seeing threats to staff safety, security, operational neutrality, public support, fundraising. A survey we ran last year of UNHCR personnel, we had responses from 75 of our country operations, found that The majority of our staff had witnessed disinformation, hate speech, negatively impacting the delivery of UNHCR's mandate, and 1 in 5 of our personnel surveyed have personally been targeted with misinformation in the capacity of their role. I know it's known, but I think it's not said enough, and especially outside of our world as well, because the headline, and which brings me to the topic that we're here to talk about today, is that AI is turbocharging this already volatile problem. To start with, just to emphasize a point, AI isn't just about tech. AI is a tool used by humans, of course, and ethical, effective use of AI in humanitarian action requires human collaboration and impact. So bringing together the people who understand the tech with the people who understand the humans, the history, the challenges, the context, the pressures, the behaviours, people with a vision for what good looks like. And you know, in the spirit of the collaboration that brings us here today, those stakeholders obviously include the experts, the tech policymakers, the AI engineers, the data scientists, the digital change makers, humanitarians. But critically, at the top of the list must be communities. For us at UNHCR, that's refugees, people forced to flee, stateless communities who are best placed to prioritise how AI can help and to shape the solutions. And they're very much repeating Stella's excellent remarks on this. So moving to the issue of trust, I think we're seeing determining the trustworthiness of information in this AI age that we all inhabit is an increasingly complex problem, and we're seeing it as a growing problem, especially in conflict, crises, emergencies. I think the volume and the sophistication of AI-generated content on digital platforms, including imposter accounts and deep fakes, is making it harder than ever for people to determine what to trust in terms of the misinformation and media they see online. We see this problem very much in kind of stable countries with strong education systems. It's even more acute in unstable situations, and it's complex to answer. Is this AI generated is not equivalent to, is this trustworthy? Solutions, they must draw on the functionality of digital platforms which dominate our access to information, as well as human behavioral science. One example of this is we must find a way to attach additional context and provenance information. Where did the content come from to AI generated content to help people decide on whether or not they can trust it, and then make decisions based on that information. And let's not forget, in situations of conflict and crisis, people have to make these decisions very, very quickly. They really don't have time to double check, you know, third-party sources and so on. So these are some of the problems that we're seeing. I do think AI is probably part of the solution to mitigate and reduce these information risks. For example, it can help strengthen public resilience through educational initiatives in places where, you know, it's possible to run digital literacy education programming. But I think also we have to invest more in the research. I think, Philippe, also you spoke about some of the collaborations with academic institutions and how key they are for humanitarians. For example, research gaps into non-English language use on AI software are significant. There was an investigation by the AI Democracy Project, which found a considerable disparity between the accuracy rates of English and Spanish language responses produced by 5 leading AI models. And these are both, you know, widely spoken languages. I think when you look at much smaller, lesser used languages in Sudan, in Myanmar, as Helen mentioned, in other contexts, the research gaps and the training of the AI systems will be considerable. I'll repeat what colleagues said about context as well being another challenge. I'm often hearing from experts that AI is terrible at picking up context. It's a repeated argument from trust and safety experts at social media companies as to why humans are still needed, for example, for content moderation work, proactive crisis assessments. to see whether content being published on digital platforms contravenes policies or not. The context is essential. And as we see more and more of this work being given over to AI systems, I worry that the gaps in terms of trust and safety mechanisms are only going to grow. I think broadly, as humanitarians, we really need help in developing our understanding of evidence-based practices to address misinformation, disinformation, information integrity, information literacy. And with less and less funding in the sector, we really have to do it collaboratively. I'll leave you with one practical example of that we've worked on, and this is a new information integrity response toolkit. We just launched it last year. It can be found at www.unhcr.org. I'll put the link in the chat later. But it was developed in very close collaboration with humanitarian partners, with digital organisations, academia, but very much informed by forcibly displaced communities who we work with around the world. This toolkit has practical tools and guidance on understanding the risks, how to detect and analyse, how to assess, and then guidance on appropriate responses. There's so much more to do. This toolkit is not very strong yet on AI generated content and AI responses. We look forward to working together with partners, and this really is an open call for help and support and collaboration. We're open to work. I think my time's probably up, Justin, but with that, I just want to say it's not possible, I think, to have a silver bullet for discerning trustworthiness of content in this AI age, but it really should be possible to create adaptive tools, comprehensive tools, inclusive tools that help people engage with digital content critically and responsibly, and especially in the pressures of crisis settings. Thanks very much, and back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Gisela. And the experience that you brought, as well as the other speakers, I think has been exceptionally helpful today in understanding this very worrying trend that is directly impacting humanitarians and the people who are, more importantly, seeking the assistance that they're looking for. I'll ask you to stay on, and I'll invite Philippe to join you, and just to pose a question to the two of you. That given the fragmented nature of AI experimentation in the sector, how can humanitarian organizations, tech partners, policymakers better collaborate to develop scalable and ethical AI solutions against misinformation? And Gisela, if you could go first, and then Philippe could chime in, and then maybe we'll even have Helen just say a quick word at the end as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think one really important issue is awareness raising, convening. I think having these big questions, these big problems to solve on the agenda of multilateral, multi-stakeholder fora like AI for Good and this AI for Humanitarian Action series, but also regional level events, local events, and also through networked organisations like our partners at CDAC. And I think Helen will probably speak to that. It's more important than ever. I think I'm really concerned that these challenges are not widely seen or recognised outside of the humanitarian world. So as much as possible for humanitarians to insert themselves and raise awareness and ask for help in other fora. We were really pleased to have an event last week at the Africa Digital Rights and Inclusion Forum in Zambia, along with a delegation of 10 refugees who were able to actively discuss issues with big tech companies, local actors, digital rights. We'll be engaging in, other fora, I think some of the usual suspects as well. But I think the more that we can find platforms for engagement outside of, the kind of New York, Geneva type places, I think the more we can work together finding solutions. The other thing I'd just point to as well is a call for greater coordination and alignment amongst us humanitarian organisations in how we engage with tech and AI companies and digital platforms. We've talked about the research gap, the evidence gap, and that's really needed for advocacy, as well as technical solutions such as, improved content moderation in local languages by AI systems. I know, I'm singing from the same hymn sheet as many of my colleagues that are really active in this. I think we all recognise it's a big challenge. It also needs investment and resources, but I think that's a big need. The more we can be aligned in that, the better the chances of success. Thanks, Justin. Back to you.
Excellent. Thank you. Philippe, can you take up that topic as well?
No, thank you. And Gisela has said quite a lot, and I'm sure Ellen will complement. The question of ensuring that both at the vertical level and at the horizontal level, there is a sense of common understanding of what the issue is I think the first step, where we have leaders, policymakers, etc., people who are outside the reality, the reality of the ground is something that is important, and that's one of the things that we are trying to do.
Philippe, can I ask you just to pull your mic a little closer?
Sorry, yeah, exactly. Sorry, I realized that. So trying to get the attention of all the different levels, including those who are not really grounded in the local realities. And this is something we have been trying to do. I will be present together with several colleagues at the European Humanitarian Forum with a new installation called Deepfake and New, just to raise the awareness of what it is to be the subject of a deepfake. We try to create this sense of it is not that science fiction, this is the reality, and being sure that the means that are at the disposal of the different organizations are there, but also that there is a sense of urgency that at all levels, from the leadership, but also the policymakers, etc., that there are things that needs to be done because we see the consequence. And then it goes back that unfortunately the burden of proof lies on the organizations to demonstrate that this is a concrete harm, or this is something that is quite tangible. When we have an explosion, an attack, when we hear about torture, people are really understanding it. But when it's less physical, if I may use this word, it's much more complex to understand this dimension. And we know the psychological dimension of not knowing where to go to get food or what information is true or not. The psychological dimension is not understood because people cannot relate to that. So working together with different partners, this is something we have done in the past to write a framework together with Gisela and a few other partners who are, I'm sure, on the call, trying to share the practices, the best practices, try to get on board new actors. And this is, as I mentioned already, the academic world, which is getting more and more interested by testing their tools, by providing support to local organizations, not only the ICRC and the UNHCR, but also trying to look and anchor their research into a reality. This is something which is important, yeah, working together, having this kind of discussions is definitely important. And as ICRC member of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, I just wanted to say a happy Red Cross Red Crescent Day. I'm sure there are a few people on the call who are part of that network. So thanks.
Yeah, and a happy day to all of your colleagues at ICRC and the Federation and the Red Crescent. We see the flags on the buses through Geneva this week to remind us of that. Helen, can you chime in just a bit on this before we move to the next question?
Yeah, absolutely. And really to just echo what my colleagues have said, but then to build on that and to say that we offer a slightly different approach in being a quite light, agile network with lots of members. So our added value is to try to accelerate the take-up, the identification and the take-up of good practices across the sector. So we run communities of practice to bring people together to hear what's going on the ground and what people are struggling with and then what they're navigating through. So we do that on the harmful information front, but then also more prescient for this is on the participatory AI front, right? CDAC's traditionally been known very much for the participation and accountability expertise, as well as the communication and media development practitioners. And it's really like accepted in the global north that in order to protect your bottom line when you're rolling out AI-enabled capabilities, you need diversity of views and you need to co-design whatever you're doing with your target audience. We in the humanitarian sector haven't quite embedded that commitment fully. And it's really important, particularly when resources are very scarce, that we make sure that what we are designing in terms of AI capabilities includes a co-design element with the communities we're intending to help, both at that operational delivery use case end and at the governance level, in case there's a need for redress or accountability. So it's just to point out those two elements. And we do have a new project, Safe AI, which is hoping to provide some very usable, practical tools for practitioners in the coming weeks. So please, if people are interested to watch this space, there'll be a co-design tool around participation. There's also going to be an AI readiness checklist, stuff that will be immediately practically relevant and useful for people in the field and thinking this through at the headquarters level. Over.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much. Gisela and Philippe, thank you very much. Helen, I'll ask you to stay and invite Stella back in for another question. How can AI-driven tools be designed to truly prioritize the needs and voices of local communities, ensuring that these tools don't inadvertently exclude or misrepresent the populations that are affected by crisis? Helen, if I can ask you to kick that off.
I won't take much time and give Stella the majority of the space for this one, but just to say that maybe some of our procurement choices at the outset will be quite interesting to support how we prioritise local community needs. Just a flag that a lot of the capabilities can be built, and there's interesting capabilities being built in situ or in regional hubs. So just an early point to say what's able to be built and procured locally, point number one, that can then be more easily informed by the appropriate ethics and weightings of the communities that we're trying to reach. And then, as I was just mentioning, this participatory AI, this needs to very quickly become a no-brainer for humanitarians. And we need the tools and the muscle to be developed to just do this as a matter of course, even in an environment of very scarce resources. Because if we skip over this step, the risk is that some of the good practice that we're trying to inject into the system at the moment could be blowback. So I think doing participation well at the outset, using the new AI capabilities in some instances, will be a way to try to get that community voice into these discussions. Stella, over to you.
Well, Stella, just before you come in, I just want to again encourage our audience to put any questions they have in the Q&A, the chat, because we will move after this and respond to any of those that we do receive. So Stella, over to you. The floor is yours.
Many thanks again, Justin. So I think just to reflect again on the context that I work and where a majority of affected population, people in displacement, which is the global south, come from, I think really what needs to be considered and what needs to happen is therefore availability of information that defines the identity of this big group of people, because that speaks basically to how they even think about us providing services to them. It talks about their languages, it talks about their culture, their way of life, which is missing. And therefore, I think it's one of the foundational requirements to ensure that what relates to the identity of majority of the affected population from the global south is actually thought about. And just kind of secondly, to draw back into, again, the values within the humanitarian sector that we built over time is really transparency, because at the end of the day, sometimes because of the many related constraints while we are providing services, there is always the tendency to do what we think is good before engaging the community. So I think, this ethical practices that we built over time, or humanitarian practices and values, need to be considered. And, Helen talked about that a little bit, but really engaging communities, informing communities, educating communities has to be a fundamental part of that. And, I think we constantly measure all our work against whatever kinds of standards and humanitarian principles. And I think AI, as something that's going to be a big part of our provision of services, is something that also needs to be it needs to be considered. And I think some of the things also that we have advocated for over time is therefore working in partnership, collaborating, that enables us to learn from each other and to avoid duplication, efficiency in how we use resources. Because at the end of the day, right now there might be tools that are being built across already 20 big institutions. And I think that's something that needs to be streamlined, that we are collaborating to ensure that we are working in lockstep as we build those tools that help us to be effective and to have some similarities and some standards. And I think, of course, I said that in the beginning, when we talk about issues of equity, is to ensure also that all the way from the tech companies, United Nations, to international organizations, is that it needs to come downstream to how all the way to the affected person. For FilmAid, we talk about the person being at the center and being at the center of the wisdom of how services need to be provided. So I think that must be deeply prioritized, that all the people in the chain that are involved must be part and parcel of designing the tools that need to be applied. And I think, of course, thinking about communicating effectively to communities about how the whole chain, how, of course, we're going to be using technology on them, and also how we are storing this data, where is this data being stored, for example, communicating on issues of data protection effectively. And I feel always the responsibility that, because we're talking about communities that don't speak the aid languages, they are uneducated. Sometimes there's the temptation that, what is the point of doing that? And I think we must consider the dignity of the person and value of the person, irrespective of whether they understand or not. There's just the foundational responsibility on our part to ensure that communities are very clear across board of what is being applied to them. Justin.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Stella. That concludes the panelists' interventions. I'd like to invite all the panelists to come back to respond to some of the questions we're receiving through the neural network. And the first one is thinking about the particular AI capabilities that posing increased threats for MDHS in a humanitarian context. Which ones are the panelists most concerned about? Which ones are which ones keep you up at night and the potential harm from as far as the AI threats for disinformation and the spreading of what is really undermining the work that we are trying to do to assist people in need. Anyone want to grab onto that? Gisela.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick it off.
Please.
I mean, I think broadly AI's just made it a lot cheaper and easier to carry out these information risks, to launch harmful information campaigns. And I think especially for low-resourced actors, whether their intention is financial gain or political and so on, it's become super easy to write very persuasive false and adversarial content and imagery. And I'm sure, Philippe can tell us more about deepfakes, whether that's audio or video and so on. I also worry about the impact of AI-driven algorithms worsening, existing algorithmic bias. And as I mentioned in my remarks, the increasing trend from digital platforms to hand over content moderation to AI systems, which are not really resourced to make decisions on what content is safe and so on. I mean, on the positive side, of course, I think AI can help. I think in talking about content moderation, this is a terribly difficult job. It can probably protect humans from seeing some of the worst on the internet, but that human in the loop is still essential. And then last of all, I'm really worried about the broad effects of what I think people are calling AI slop. I think too much information pollution, making it much harder to determine what you can trust, and too little correction. So these are the things that keep me up at night, in terms of the correction. Really, Gen AI is having a profound impact on worsening harmful information on trust and safety provisions, on guardrails, and where's that correction going to come from and how quickly? Sorry if that's a bit bleak.
A little bleak, but sobering and perhaps quite helpful in that regard. A quick follow-up, maybe to Philippe. We can all spot the six-fingered image and go, "Oh, that isn't what we're looking for." But these are becoming more sophisticated systems, and where is this headed?
So there are two different elements that kind of keep me up at night. The fact that these tools carry on stereotypes, and I had an interesting discussion with the researcher at the Institute of Tropical Medicine in Antwerp, who was doing a research on the question of how do humanitarian organizations use AI for their images, for their pictures. And he mentioned something quite interesting is, do you think that the tools were trained on the archives, the pictures of the ICRC? I will never know, most probably, or maybe. But if we go back to the history and the images of how humanitarian action was portrayed in the 60s or even before, the question of reinforcing stereotype for me become obvious through this example. But there are many more examples of, you have text or programs that have been built on data that are totally wrong. So that's one element. The second element, which is much more ICRC kind of domain, is how much these tools are used to breach international humanitarian law. So there is no provision against AI specifically or against deepfake or anything like that. But there are clear provisions to say it is prohibited to encourage or order IHL violations. It is prohibited to encourage violence against civilians or against civilian objects. It is prohibited to spread terror among civilian populations. So what I'm worried is, as Gisela mentioned, the fact that the entry price is very cheap now, as opposed to before when it was really complicated to launch big campaigns. This is becoming the new normal. And eventually, the common humanity we all have, which is the basis of our action, is totally lost because it's so simple to now kill someone just based on this information and the fact that you might control the mind or the behavior of certain people just by pouring them with false information or information that goes against what we stand for, which is the fact that any human beings is allowed to have their own agency and their capacity to live simply.
Thank you. Great. Stella, I'm going to punt that over to you as well.
I just wanted to chime in on some of the threats, which is firstly the content that can be generated is actually quite appealing, and that can easily move with speed and actually reach a mass population very quickly, and therefore cause mass harm. And then I think the other sort of concern is also the fact that who is responsible when somebody causes harm, because it's like an unknown world behind the keyboard. So I just wanted to just put across those two threats that I see as it relates to also this quickly evolving space of communication and technology.
Great, thank you. Look, we have time for one quick response. Let me go to Helen on this one. You mentioned the key to collaborate as a sector in areas like addressing directly big tech sector, but what would our big asks be to big tech? What would we ask as a sector that could help? Just a quick response on that, and then we'll move to the close.
Okay, I'm going to also pick up on the last question, if I may, as well, Justin. In terms of what I'm worried about and where I see this trend going, I encountered a really interesting concept that's been put forward by Sam Gregory at Witness most recently, or at least that's where I learned of it, called epistemic warfare, right? And what that means is we're seeing a sort of attack on how knowledge is created, right? And we've always had this in humanitarian and fragile settings where there's conflict actors pursuing their own agenda. We've not seen it in the way that we're now seeing it in the global north over the recent months, where long-standing norms and traditions about how evidence and knowledge is created are themselves under threat. And where that trend line goes is deeply, deeply concerning, and should be keeping. We should all be keeping an eye on how we push back against some of those more worrying trends, on how we create knowledge and truth, right? And then in terms of how we approach tech, there's also been a real pivot, right? I mean, Gisela, Philippe, Stella, all of us have all been to Menlo Park over the years trying to make inroads with people, interlocutors in various ways. That we're in a new era, right? And so the big asks of those, particularly social media platforms over the years, have been fairly consistent, right? You need a way to take down stuff that is seen as broadly harmful. You need a way that gets past the English language dominance. You need to balance your profit margins with the harm that's being created. You need to work with society, not just extract value from us. And that has got us to the position that we're in now, where we've seen some ways, we've seen some progress, and we've also seen some real steps backward, right? So I think we may actually be moving into the era of having to ask ourselves collectively, how do we adapt to that? What do we need to do differently? And it might be that we're going to have to make some different choices about how we engage with social media platforms or tech, who are themselves becoming very significant geopolitical actors, often driving conflict dynamics in the places that we're concerned about. So I don't have a ready answer in terms of what our specific asks are, but my ask to the collective sector is, let's think differently about how we approach these actors to make sure that we get the best possible effect given the political environment that we're in.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, that's all the time we have for the questions. I want to move to some closing thoughts from our panelists. Stella, could you lead us off just a couple of minutes? What groundbreaking strategies or innovative solutions might you envision that we could harness to uphold truth and trust in humanitarian action and mitigate some of this the disinformation that is out there? So Stella, kick us off, and then we'll have Gisela, Helen, and then conclude with Philippe. Stella, over to you.
Thank you, Justin. So I think for me is to focus more on our process, picking up from the last point from Helen, which is our collaboration with tech companies, and of course ourselves as humanitarian actors and the communities. I think our work as humanitarian actors is very much reliant on the trust that we build with the communities. Therefore, how do we actually then bring all these different actors, and of course at different times, to build a collective solution that enables us obviously to move forward. And I think, as I said, some of these principles that we've built over time need to really be factored in along the way as we go along. There's definitely a significant amount of work to be done for us as a communication specialist. Again, a lot around language translation and just information being available as quickly and timely way to the communities, and of course in a way that enables us to detect the misinformation or any kind of harmful information. So I think there's really some possibilities through collaboration and partnership that is coordinated for us to arrive at a positive step and solution. Justin.
Great, thank you so much, Stella. Gisela, can I call on you to give us your final thoughts?
I think broadly, and thanks too much for AI for Good for giving space to this issue. Let's have more of that, and also space where we can really start to show practical case studies, although recognizing that sometimes the case studies are a little sensitive, so we need a flexible fora to do that. I would also say that we're speaking about languages here, but there's also two languages, the language of tech, the language of humanitarians, and we need to speak each other's language. So as much as possible, putting the tech experts, the AI experts in the room with the humanitarians. AI itself is a tool created by humans. So let's bring the humans at either end, the ones building the tool, the one using the tool, the ones being pushed to use the tool, with communities and local organisations at the heart. It's ambitious, but I think, Helen, as you said, this has to be the no-brainer of the approach.
Great. Thank you very much, Zala. Helen, over to you. Final thoughts. Helen, I believe you're on mute.
I was just saying,
back 2020 then. I got nostalgia.
Someone had to do it. Someone had to do it. I was just saying very enthusiastically that I am delighted we are no longer talking about this issue as if it's a comms issue. So point number one is like excellent progress in terms of we now understanding it as much more systemic, much more of a strategic vulnerability to humanitarian efforts. And it's much more of a real life protection risk to communities, right? So this is great progress, point number one. The next step is moving beyond this obsession with social media monitoring and trying to do truth and verification. We are going to be outwitted by the capabilities that are coming online so fast. And we need to give ourselves the space to move from being very reactive to building much more resilience. And one of the more exciting things that I've seen AI-enabled capabilities, more from the OSINT community, is where you can take an X-ray of the sort of social media environment and the narratives that are being stood up. So you can see the bots in action and you can see them talking to one another. And when you sort of pull back the curtain through these AI-enabled capabilities and you suddenly see what is happening in the information environment, I really think people will be less likely to believe what some of those manipulated methodologies, and they are very much manipulated methodologies that are being stood up in the kinds of conflicts and crises that we're operating in. So the more we can get those capabilities into humanitarian action and then make it available in the languages that people themselves are speaking in channels that people trust, the better. And I think we will be able to find a way to do that.
Excellent, Helen. Thank you very much. And finally, Philippe, I turn to you for your final thoughts for today's session.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not the right person to be optimistic, but I will try with two elements that are for us important in terms of something that is worrying and therefore trying to find solution for it. One is the trend that it went from kind of criticism towards organizations to people, staff, etc., who are now outed, who are doxxed by people online. And therefore, this is a question of data, digital hygiene that I think people are more and more aware. I'm hearing more people saying, okay, I'm leaving this social network, or I'm putting less personal information, all this kind of thing. So one element that I see as interesting, I would say, is digital hygiene. The second one, which is also a bit depressing, is I'm afraid that we will change the burden of proof, or we reverse the burden of proof. It won't be anymore to show what we are doing, but to demonstrate what we say that is true. So things related to certification or watermarking or whatever. I'm convinced that I forgot who mentioned it, the fact that there is so much information, it's difficult to find what is true and not true. So how much we have to communicate ourselves also proactively to say this is validated, etc. Now, the more positive one is really working and finding and working with allies. I think the AI for Good is an interesting platform. I've been the two last editions at the summit. And I think it's by going there, by speaking the language of humanitarians, but with this tech dimension, and you will find people, you will find organization. I love academics, as you heard, but there are other people who are ready to provide interesting solutions. And this is by explaining the dilemmas, the consequences that maybe one day we'll find interesting and positive solutions. Thank you.
Great, thank you again. Once again, a very happy Red Crescent Day to you and the colleagues. That brings us to the end of the session, and I think it's been extremely interesting, certainly for myself. The ideas of context, of language, of the tailored nature that disinformation is taking, and often being monetized, and people making money from it in a context where we are trying to combat it in a period where we are seeing resources shrinking. So it is a bit of an uphill. So I think Philippe's point of perhaps he's not the one to be the optimist, but I think we do need to take a sober look at this. It is causing harm to the people who we are trying to assist, and it does put some of our colleagues in danger as well, and that's quite very worrying going forward. So I thank you for this. Another important installment in our series here. We do have one more left in the series for the spring. That's on the 15th of May. So in a week's time, Powering the Future, Funding and Sustaining AI for the Humanitarian Impact. So we invite you all to join us for that. The fall series is currently under development, and more information will be coming your way on that. Apologies to any of the questions we couldn't get to. We'll see if we can't get some of the panelists to respond to them, and we can put them up on the social media. Also, the repeats of this session will be posted, the recording. So please, if you haven't watched the whole thing, or you want to rewatch it, or you want to recommend it to a friend or colleague, it is there for you to do so. I want to thank you all. I want to thank Julian and Rafik and Merlinda and others behind the scenes who put this all together. And I wish you all a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learnt something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the e-shop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for good.